David's grip on his glass tightened as he watched Emily, every gesture she made feeling somehow rehearsed, each laugh a little too vibrant. She had become more of a stranger lately, her warmth toward him cooling, replaced by a polished charm reserved for everyone else. The thought crept in again, uninvited but relentless. Was it just his imagination, or was something slipping through his fingers? The late hours, the secretive calls, the almost imperceptible but undeniable shift in her touch, her tone, her eyes, everything hinted at something that he dreaded to name. Standing there, in the middle of a party that felt like it wasn't his, surrounded by people who seemed oblivious to the storm inside him, David felt the unsettling truth taking shape. Maybe tonight, he'd finally uncover what his instincts had been warning him about. "Hello." Earth to David, a voice broke into his thoughts. "You look like you're analyzing that whiskey glass like it's evidence in a trial." David turned to see Lisa Carter, his close friend and fellow lawyer, raising an eyebrow at him. He forced a grin. "Just got work on my mind." Lisa scoffed. "Really? At your own party? Spill it, David. What's actually going on?" Before he could answer, a tall, charming man with a bit of gray in his hair stepped up to Emily's group. David watched as Jack Emerson, the real estate hotshot, effortlessly slid into the conversation. Emily's face brightened, and she laughed at something Jack said, her hand casually touching his arm. David felt his jaw tighten. He finished his whiskey in one gulp. "I need some air," he muttered to Lisa, setting down his glass and heading for the patio. The cool night breeze cleared his head a bit. David took a deep breath, trying to push down the gnawing suspicions in his mind. He was a seasoned defense attorney, known for his sharp eye and attention to detail, but tonight, he wished he could switch that part of his brain off. "Mr. Mitchell," a quiet voice cut through his thoughts. David turned to see Nate Larson, his private investigator, standing just out of sight. "Nate," David nodded. "Got something for me?" Nate glanced around, making sure no one was listening, then spoke in a low tone. "As you asked, I've been tracking Mr. Emerson. He's been seen entering your home a number of times while you were out." David felt his stomach drop, but he kept his face neutral. "How many times are we talking about?" "At least 5 in the past 2 weeks, Nate replied. "Always during your usual work hours?" David gave a short nod, his mind racing. "Don't stop digging. I want everything, where they go, what they do, anyone they meet. Leave nothing uncovered." Nate nodded, then disappeared back into the shadows, leaving David alone with his thoughts. He stood there a while, staring at the perfectly manicured lawn, his hands gripping the patio railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally went back inside, his expression was calm, but beneath the surface, anger brewed. The party continued around him, but David now saw things in a different light. He picked up on the subtle glances exchanged between Emily and Jack, the way they seemed to draw toward each other even when talking with others. Each small detail added another crack to the foundation of their marriage. As the night wore on, David ended up at a table with several colleagues, including Lisa. They were in the middle of chatting about a recent high-profile case when Jack strolled over, wearing a smug grin. "Quite the event, Mitchell," Jack said, his tone thick with fake friendliness. "Your wife really knows how to host." David felt the tension around him intensify. He looked up at Jack, keeping his expression calm even though anger was simmering just beneath the surface. "She certainly does," he replied with a measured tone. Jack leaned closer, speaking low but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Your wife will be spending a night with me." Silence blanketed the table. All eyes shifted to David, anticipating his response. He felt Lisa tense beside him, clearly ready to step in if needed. Meeting Jack's stare, David's voice turned ice-cold and deadly firm. "You have 30 seconds to get out, or I'll make sure you never use your manhood again." Jack's face drained of color, his cocky demeanor collapsing under David's unyielding glare. For a brief moment, it seemed he might try to stand his ground, but self-preservation won out. Muttering a curse under his breath, Jack turned and shoved his way through the crowd toward the exit. With that, the party started to thin out, guests murmuring quietly as they left, casting curious glances back. David stayed seated, calmly sipping his drink as if nothing had happened. Leaning in, Lisa asked quietly, "David, what on earth was that?" "Just taking out the trash," he replied, his voice void of any emotion. After the last guest filed out, David found himself alone with Rachel in the living room. She stood by the fireplace, fidgeting nervously with her hands. "David, let me explain," she began, but he raised his hand to cut her off. "Don't bother, Rachel. I know everything." Rachel's face crumpled. "Please, David, it was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to go this far." "To what?" David snapped, his voice biting. "To bring another man into our lives. To lie to my face for weeks. To humiliate me in front of our friends and coworkers." Tears began streaming down Rachel's face. "I'm sorry, truly. Please, can't we talk this through? Can we find a way to fix this?" David looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was cold and steady. "You'll get exactly what's coming to you, Rachel. But don't think for a second that I'll forgive you." Fear flickered in Rachel's eyes as the weight of her actions hit her fully. What are you planning to do?" David turned, heading toward his study. "You'll find out soon enough," he replied over his shoulder, leaving her standing alone in the empty room. Once in his study, David poured himself another whiskey and lit a cigar. Sinking into his leather chair, he gazed at the wall, his mind racing. Rachel's betrayal wasn't something he'd ever forgive, and he had no intention of letting her or Jack walk away unscathed. He picked up his phone and dialed Chris's number. "Chris," he said when the investigator answered, "I need you to dig into Jack Harper's life, his business deals, finances, personal relationships, everything. There's more here than just an affair, and I want to know all of it." "Understood, Mr. Carter," Chris replied. "I'll get started right away." David ended the call and leaned back, blowing a stream of smoke toward the ceiling. The wheels in his mind were already turning, each piece of his plan falling into place. Rachel and Jack had no idea what was headed their way. As dawn began to break through the study window, David straightened his tie and stood. He had work to do, and he was going to make sure both Rachel and Jack regretted ever crossing him. David Carter wasn't one to forgive, he believed in justice, cold, calculated, and relentless. And he was about to show them just what that meant. The morning sun streamed through the blinds in David Carter's downtown office, casting long shadows over his desk. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, listening to the man across from him. "Jack Harper is a snake," Eric Sanders spat, his face contorted in disgust. "He's been sabotaging my deals for years, but I've never been able to pin anything on him." David leaned in, his eyes sharp. "And now?" Eric grinned, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "Now I've got proof. My insider has been sending me information for months, doctored accounts, bribes, you name it." David opened the folder, flipping through the documents as possibilities raced through his mind. He looked up at Eric. "Who's the source?" "Rachel Lee," Eric replied. "One of the top talents in his company. She's fed up and wants to take him down from the inside." David nodded, a plan already forming. "I'll need to speak with her directly. Set up a meeting, somewhere discreet." After Eric left, David picked up his phone. "Chris, I need you to confirm a few things for me. And keep looking into Jack's personal life, I want every skeleton in his closet exposed." The next day, David met Rachel in a quiet cafe on the city's edge. She was younger than he had imagined, with a keen look and a no-nonsense air about her. "Mr. Carter," she said, shaking his hand firmly, "I hope you realize the risk I'm taking by coming here. David nodded, his voice low and reassuring. I do, Ms. Lee, and I promise it'll be worth your while. Now, tell me everything you know about Jack's operations. For the next hour, Rachel detailed a tangled web of fraud and embezzlement. David listened closely, occasionally probing for details. Why now? He asked, studying her. Why turn on him at this point? Her eyes narrowed. Because he preys on people, uses them, then tosses them aside like they're nothing. He thinks no one can touch him. I want him to know he's wrong. David smiled grimly. On that, Ms. Lee, we're completely aligned. In the weeks that followed, David worked non-stop, assembling a rock-solid case against Jack. He coordinated with Eric and Rachel, pulling together evidence and preparing witnesses. Meanwhile, he kept up appearances at home, staying outwardly calm around his wife, Sarah. One evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, Sarah brought up the conversation they had both been skirting. David, she said cautiously, I know things haven't been easy between us, but I thought maybe we could talk about how to move forward, maybe even reconcile. David met her gaze, his expression calm and composed. Of course, Sarah. I've done some thinking myself. A glimmer of hope crossed her face. You have? He nodded, taking a sip of wine. Yes. I think we should go slow. Start over, build back trust. She reached across the table, taking his hand. Yes, absolutely. I'll do whatever it takes, David. I promise. As she squeezed his hand, David felt only the cold resolve inside him. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Glad to hear that, Sarah. Very glad indeed. The following day, David initiated the next step of his plan. He cashed in old favors, circulated carefully crafted rumors, and ensured that murmurs of Sarah's affair reached all the right people. Within a few days, Sarah's phone calls became infrequent. Clients began canceling appointments, giving vague reasons, and her once lively social circle started to dwindle. I don't get it, Sarah said one evening, frustration plain in her voice. It's like everyone's avoiding me. Even the Williamses canceled their anniversary party booking. David pretended to be sympathetic. That's odd. Maybe it's just a slow spell. I'm sure it'll turn around soon. But it didn't. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's business kept declining. David observed as she grew increasingly anxious, making desperate phone calls and sending out frantic emails. One night, he overheard her pleading on the phone with Jack. Please, Jack, she said, her voice trembling. I need your help. My business is falling apart, and I have no idea what to do. There was a long pause, and then Sarah's face crumpled. But I thought we meant something to each other. After she hung up, sobbing, David returned to his study. Pouring himself a whiskey, he allowed a small, satisfied smile. Everything was falling into place. The following morning, David's phone buzzed with a call from Chris. Mr. Carter, Chris said, his tone charged with excitement, I've found something major. Jack has been siphoning off millions from his own company into offshore accounts. David's grip tightened on the phone. Excellent work, Chris. Send me everything. It's time to go forward. With the final piece of evidence in hand, David moved to the next phase of his plan. He filed a lawsuit against Jack Harper on behalf of multiple former clients, citing fraud and embezzlement. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. David stood before the judge, speaking clearly and confidently as he presented the case. Your Honor, he began, the evidence will prove that Mr. Harper has engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud, deceiving not only his clients but also his employees and business associates. As witness after witness took the stand, Jack's face turned paler with each testimony. Rachel Lee's statements were particularly devastating, providing first-hand insight into Jack's illegal actions. During cross-examination, David went in for the final blow. "Mr. Harper," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "could you clarify the discrepancies in your company's financial records, specifically, the millions that seem to have disappeared into offshore accounts?" Jack stammered, sweat beginning to glisten on his forehead. I have no idea what you're talking about. This has to be a mistake." David stepped closer to the witness stand, holding up a stack of documents. "A mistake? These bank records show transfers to offshore accounts under your name. Are you claiming these are fake, Mr. Harper?" The courtroom grew silent as Jack's lawyer leaned in, urgently whispering to him. Finally, Jack slumped in his seat, defeated. "No," he mumbled. "They're not fake." As the judge issued an order to freeze Jack's assets pending further investigation, David glanced over at Eric, who gave him a subtle nod of approval from the gallery. Outside the courthouse, reporters quickly gathered around David. "Mr. Carter," one journalist called out, "how does it feel to bring down one of the city's most powerful figures?" David faced the reporters, his expression steely. "This isn't about bringing anyone down," he stated firmly. "It's about justice. No one is above the law, no matter how rich or powerful they may be." As questions continued pouring in, David noticed Sarah standing on the edge of the crowd, her face pale with shock and fear. He walked past her without acknowledgement, leaving her to face the fallout of her actions on her own. That evening, David sat alone in his study, savoring a glass of scotch when his phone buzzed with a message from Chris. Jack tried to escape. They nabbed him at the airport. David allowed himself a quiet smile. Phase 1 was complete. Jack Harper was done for, but David wasn't stopping there, not even close. Early the next morning, Sarah found divorce papers waiting on the kitchen table. David observed her calmly as she picked them up, her hands trembling. "David," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face, "please, don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." David met her gaze, his expression icy. "It's too late, Sarah. You made your choice, and now you're going to live with it." As Sarah broke down in tears, David left the house, shutting the door behind him. He had a meeting with Eric to discuss the future of Jack's now failed company. The wheels of justice and retribution kept turning, and David was the one steering them. There would be no second chances, only consequences. The morning sun cast long shadows over the expansive lawn of Jack Harper's mansion. Crime scene tape fluttered in the wind as federal agents combed through the property, carrying out boxes of evidence. David watched the scene unfold from across the street, satisfaction in his gaze. His phone buzzed, it was Chris. "Mr. Carter," Chris's voice crackled over the speaker, "Jack Harper is in custody. They got him trying to board a jet to Mexico." David's lips curved into a slight smile. "Well done, Chris. Keep me updated on any new developments." As he hung up, a black SUV pulled up beside him, the window rolling down to reveal Eric's stern face. "Quite the spectacle," Eric said, glancing at the mansion. David turned to him. "Yes, it is. I assume everything is moving forward as planned on your end?" Eric gave a sly smile. "Oh, it's all in motion. My team's moving in to take over what's left of Harper's empire. By next week, it'll all belong to us." "And Rachel Lee?" David asked, raising an eyebrow. "She's getting a promotion she's earned," Eric replied. "She'll head our new acquisitions department, a well-deserved reward." David nodded in approval. "Good. She took a big risk, and it's only right she reaps the benefits." As Eric's car drove off, David took one last look at the ruins of Jack Harper's life. Phase 2 was complete. Now, it was time for the final act. Across town, in a shabby apartment, Sarah sat on a worn-out couch, staring blankly at the TV as the news covered Jack's arrest and the collapse of his business empire. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. She opened it to see a courier holding an envelope. "Sarah Carter?" the courier asked. She nodded, her hands trembling as she accepted the envelope. As soon as she shut the door, she tore it open, finding divorce papers inside, every line already completed in David's neat, deliberate handwriting. All that remained was her signature. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face as she shakily dialed David's number. He answered on the third ring. "Yes. David, please," she sobbed. "Can we meet in person? I know I made a terrible mistake, but I still love you. Can't we work this out somehow?" A long silence stretched on the other end before David finally spoke, his tone cold and distant. "Fine. Meet me at Grant Hill Park in an hour." An hour later, Sarah stood by the railing at the park, gazing over the city lights sprawled out below. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, and there was David, his expression unreadable. "David," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for coming." He stood beside her, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You wanted to talk. Go ahead." Taking a deep breath, Sarah began, "I know what I did was beyond forgiveness, but David, we've shared so much. We built a life together. Can't we try to save something from this?" David turned to face her, his gaze icy. "Save what, Sarah? The trust you shattered? The vows you threw away? Tell me, what exactly do you think is left?" "Our love," she whispered, reaching for his hand. He pulled back, his expression hardening. "Love? Love doesn't deceive, Sarah. Love doesn't betray. What you're feeling isn't love, it's fear. Fear of facing the reality of what you've done." Tears welled up in her eyes. "David, please. I'll do anything, just tell me what it would take to make this right." David regarded her with an unreadable stare. After a pause, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a pen. "You want to fix this?" he said, extending the pen to her. "Then sign the divorce papers. That's the only way forward." Sarah looked at the pen, then back at David's face, searching for any glimpse of the man she once knew. Finding none, she slowly accepted the pen from his hand. "Is this really what you want?" she whispered, barely audible. David's response was sharp and unwavering. "This is what you chose, Sarah, the moment you betrayed everything we built." Her hand shaking, Sarah signed her name. As she handed the papers back, a small part of her hoped for some sign that it wasn't truly over. But David simply tucked the papers into his jacket. "Goodbye, Sarah," he said, turning to walk away. "David," she called out, desperation breaking her voice, "is there any chance you'll ever forgive me?" He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Some things, Sarah, are beyond forgiveness. This is one of them." With that, he walked away, leaving her alone to face the consequences of her choices. The following morning, David settled into his new office, now a full partner in Zane Caldwell's rapidly expanding business empire. He gazed out over the city, a city that had borne witness to Braden Huxley's downfall, the unraveling of his marriage, and the meticulous execution of a plan months in the making. A knock on the door drew him from his thoughts. It was Vanessa. "Hey," she greeted, leaning against the doorframe. "How are you holding up?" David gestured for her to sit. "I'm fine, Vanessa. Why wouldn't I be?" She took a seat across from him, worry etched in her expression. "David, you just brought down one of the most powerful men in the city and ended a 15-year marriage. It's okay if you're not feeling fine." David leaned back, his face as calm and composed as ever. "What's done is done. Braden and Sarah made their choices. I just made sure they faced the consequences." "And what about you?" Vanessa pressed. "What consequences are you facing?" For a brief moment, an emotion flashed across David's face, only to vanish just as quickly. "I faced my own consequences the moment I learned the truth," he replied quietly. Everything since then has been about seeking justice. Vanessa nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Just be careful, David. Revenge can hollow a person out. David managed a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I appreciate the concern, Vanessa, but I know exactly who I am and what I'm doing. As Vanessa exited, David returned his gaze to the window. The setting sun cast shades of orange and red across the Los Angeles skyline, marking the start of a new era, both for the city and for David Ross. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at a text from an unknown number. Mr. Ross, I have some information regarding a judge who's been accepting bribes. Would you be interested? David studied the message, a slow smile spreading across his face. He typed a short reply, always. Setting the phone down, he reached for a cigar, savoring the rich scent as he lit it. He thought about the journey that had led him here, the betrayal, the hurt, the meticulously planned revenge. No regret, no remorse, just the grim satisfaction of seeing it through. In this city of angels, David Ross had transformed into something else, a force of reckoning, carrying out his own vision of justice. And he was only getting started. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the city faded into twilight. But for David, this was only the dawn of a new day, one with no forgiveness, no mercy. A day where every action came with a price, and he would be there to make sure every debt was paid. He picked up his phone once more, dialing Connor's number. Connor, I've got a new job for you. Let's set up a time to meet. As he hung up, David took one last look at the darkening sky. In this game of power and vengeance, he had emerged victorious, and he intended to keep it that way, no matter the cost.